Welcome, everybody. The Institute for the History of Religions, the Romanian Academy in Bucharest, the premises of the Institute. We are very glad to welcome today our younger colleague coming from Vanderbilt University in Nashville after Yale, Mr. Matei Epure, who is a PhD candidate in history at Vanderbilt University, and who would like to entertain us with a very masterful, I guess, presentation on from parish to nation, very crucial instances of early 16th century Germany, thy neighbor, Indulgences and abstract communities in early 16th century Germany. Just before entering, just before starting your communication, dear colleague, I would like to emphasize that we are happy to be in contact with younger colleagues from abroad, from the worldwide community of scholars. And the two short announcements, first and foremost, that as this seminar is the first one after concluding the 5 months submission period for the World Congress for History of Religions in Bucharest in 2025 of September 2026, and that we received no less than 315 institutions sending abstracts from 227 cities in 57 countries in all the 6 continents, which include chairs, institutes, academias, or other outputs of research in the academic study of religions. And secondly, that on the commemoration day, 35 years after the assassination of one exceptional scholar from Romania, Ioan Petru Culianu, on the 21st of May this year, within the Institute for the History of Religions, we would organize the second edition of the seminar, a national colloquium on the religious history of Romania, which this year will tackle not the canonical or the positive episodes of the religious history of modern and contemporary Romanian space, but rather the disruptions, the problems, the problematic theological or even physical fights between religious communities in the last century or so in the religious history of Romania. So you are welcome to both events. The first one chronologically will still accept contributions, so you have only to check the website of the Institute as well as the Facebook, Instagram, YouTube pages. Thank you so much. So, dear colleague, please, I'm very happy together with my colleagues here at the Institute, with Professor Bogdan Tătaru Cazaban, with my colleague Ștefan Lungu, with all the others, with my colleague Ionuț Daniel Băncilă, and all the others who would benefit from your presentation, including from following you afterwards through our YouTube channel, please.
So thank you all for being present for this. This is an exciting event for me since it's the first time I'm ever giving a talk in my hometown. So while I am home, I'm also in sort of terra incognita in terms of academic culture and sort of wider content, since I have been in America since finishing high school. And this is a new framing for me, both in terms of being in Europe and in Romania in particular, and being in a history of religions context. I am normally, as Professor Certin mentioned, in a history department, trying to justify studying religion to people who kind of lose interest as soon as religion comes on the table. So this project has sort of attempted to have a facade of not being about religion that now I'm taking off the project, and I'm trying to bring it back to show all of its religious aspects. So this is a presentation of my work in progress. This is my dissertation work at Vanderbilt. And so I will welcome all comments. I will also be happy for any interruptions that might come up during the talk. And also, I would be very glad if someone would tell me how I'm doing on time at some point if I end up spending too much time on this. But alas, I'll just get started. And since this is a sort of flowing work in progress sort of presentation rather than something particularly definitive, I'm going to start by explaining sort of the origins of this project. And they tend to come from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where within the book at some point he makes this distinction between the notions of duty towards one's fellow human beings in aristocratic versus in democratic societies. And he's suggesting that while in an aristocratic society, you see as a fellow human being a very limited amount of people who are the people right beneath you in the hierarchy, right above you in the hierarchy, and the fellows in your family or your kin. You do owe these people rather radical self-denial. And so you need to sacrifice for them if needed up to death. That is his point. The point is not justifying whether Tocqueville is correct or not. He's describing this distinction between the shift from aristocratic societies where this is happening towards democratic societies where the people you see as fellow human beings are everyone who is a human being, but what you owe them is no longer any sort of self-sacrificial great responsibility, but the only thing you owe them is to not bother them, to not harm them. Hence things like your liberty ends where mine begins and things of the sort. And so my idea from this was sort of that if anything like this is sort of valid, then a religious sort of discourse or theological concept of what one owes their fellow human beings has to be shaped within some sort of communication with culture, either being shaped by the culture in which you exist, and then your notion of what you owe your fellow human being gets transformed by the culture, or you have to express what you owe to your fellow human being in contrast to what's happening. So the question was, when you move from sort of Christian religious ethical language within democracy, which is the concept we know, to pre-democratic context, how much does change in what Christians think they owe one another? And so the concept through which I wanted to look at this, and I thought was a very good lens to look at this through, was the idea of the neighbor, which of course is quite at the center of Christian ethics. It is the thing that Jesus describes as the greatest commandment of Christianity, which is to love your neighbor as yourself and God with all your heart, all your mind, and so on and so forth. There's also the debate in the Gospels regarding who the neighbor might be. This is a quite peculiar sort of thing to happen within English, which is what I'm generally required to do, since this is the language of my dissertation. Since English is the only language that uses a term so specific as the neighbor. Of course, the original term that gets translated as the neighbor is the Greek plesion, which is a term that gets essentially invented by the Septuagint as a sort of made up noun coming from the adjective close. So the neighbor is just the person who is close by. And this is in itself a translation of a Hebrew term, which is rea, which is more specific than just an adjective turned into a noun, but it is so broad that it can mean essentially anything you might want it to mean, from friend to lover to fellow human being to party in a contract. So it is this intentionally abstract and quite loosely defined concept, which tends to be, as most of us are Romanian and know, in the Romanian translations, it remains linguistically as sort of ambiguously defined. So in Romanian, we have apropele and virtually every other language, but English does the same sort of thing, which is to create a noun out of some adjective for proximity, including the German that I am studying. I will mention, since we are speaking in English, how we got to the neighbor, vecinul, the person who lives in the neighborhood and you borrow flour from, how that ended up being the person you owe something to within the Bible. And this comes from Wycliffe's biblical translation of 1382. Previous English translations would use things of the sort of fellow man, friend, fellow Christian, and so on and so forth with other sort of connotations. Wycliffe wanted to vernacularize the concept of the neighbor and sort of express the immediacy of what is owed to the person next to you. So you live in a neighborhood, so the person you owe something to is the person who's literally next to you, hence the neighbor. By the 16th century, this sort of wins over all other translations and becomes the settled English vernacular idea of the plesion, of the apropele. Now, as we can see, you already have sort of interpretive breadth in the translation of this with the neighbor, which is quite a loose translation of the concept. But then in modernity, if you look at it, you can see sort of other forms of abstraction of what neighbor love could sort of mean. And especially within the American context, you would have something like left-wing churches preaching that love of neighbor means voting for a candidate, for example, that will do away with racism and things of the sort. So you can vote for something, or right-wing parties could say you need to vote for the sake of your unborn neighbor, and so vote for a party that is against abortion, so on and so forth. So you have this equivalency of loving your neighbor with voting. You also have the sort of duties that you have towards your neighbor far away. So you can have fundraising for Africa, and then in order to solve the AIDS crisis, you love your neighbor by funding such things, and so on and so forth. And then there's also a notion of loving your neighbor by expressing your ideas in the public sphere, like commenting on Facebook or writing books and things of the sort. So the question is whether these sorts of possible abstractions of what neighbor love could mean are really a facet of modernity, or they predate that sort of thing. This debate is also associated with the historiographical context of Anglo-Saxon historiography that I am writing in, and one very important book on the subject, and I'm presumably going to skip the rest, is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. Now, with this book, essentially, the Anglo-Saxon historiography has sort of settled on a trend. This book is sort of describing the birth of nationalism, which it dates to the 19th century. And it suggests that in order for people to identify themselves quite viscerally with their nations, you have to have this sort of medium through which the nation to be felt viscerally. And so he's describing that supposedly something like the invention of the printed public sphere in the 19th century, which is not historically accurate, but alas, the sort of explosion of literacy in the 19th century is the thing that made the nation possible. So you have things like the novels and the newspaper and things of the sort that are creating this sort of visceral identification of the nation. The nation is an agent that does stuff, and so you can feel yourself connected to this nation, and so you can have this very immediate sort of identification to what the nation is doing, and you feel sort of morally responsible for what it's doing. The historiographical consensus tends to be that this is only something that happens in the 19th century. And before that, what happens in most of the historiography, and this is going to be one of the chapters of my dissertation, you essentially, without necessarily studying it, sort of overimpose an image of parochialism on the sort of cultures that come before. So if the 19th century is the society where we all sort of think about things together, and we think of the center as the sort of sphere where things happen and where we're responsible to care about them, and so on and so forth. So nations do things, nations are agents. The people outside of a very limited sort of elite live in a rather parochial sort of context where they don't really have an idea of nations. They don't see themselves as Romanian, German, and so on and so forth. They see their lives as sort of bounded quite firmly by the specific locality where they live. And this is quite generally present in Anglo-Saxon scholarship I have a list there of all sorts of contexts. So definitely modern books tend to do that and suggest that pre-modern sort of life was rather parochial and unbothered by sort of central ideological claims. And then this sort of sips into early modern literature as well, where the language of locality is immediately seen as a sort of discourse on hierarchy and on structure rather than anything to do with locality, because of course everyone lives in their own locality. It's not like people have the internet to see what's happening elsewhere. And so if someone's speaking about locality, they cannot be speaking about locality as opposed to something else. They have to think of it as a sort of hierarchical claim. So if someone in the early Reformation is speaking about the village as opposed to something else, they're speaking about the political or ecclesiological political independence of the village. So the question I had, first of all, was whether this is valid. And the other question that I have that started me going through this is, if this is so, then preaching the love of neighbor, what does it actually mean when you do not have these sort of abstractions and ideological sort of connotations of what neighbor love could mean? So this has got me going, and I found originally the neighbor to be quite a good lens for seeing sort of notions and scopes for neighbor love in the 16th century and sort of responsibility towards others. And you can see a lot of stuff. So the sort of stereotypical notion of Protestant ethics coming from Max Weber is that Protestants don't really preach ethics because good works don't save you. It is faith that saves you. And so presumably you would have to have the notion of responsibility to your neighbor as something that has to be abstracted away in order for you to not have a works-based soteriology. And you have snippets of that. While that is a deeply inaccurate description of how Protestants do ethics, you can see it if you look hard enough, and you can see plays, for example, of the story of the Good Samaritan that essentially have a story where responsibility doesn't seem to play into the story. It kind of tells you the story in order to conclude that Jesus is actually the Good Samaritan. So it's nothing about how you're supposed to be treating your neighbor. It's about how you relate to Jesus. You also have Melanchthon, who is Luther's immediate associate, teaching his students how to preach on things like the Good Samaritan, and he emphasizes that you need to make the allegorical reading of the Good Samaritan happen such that you have Jesus as the Good Samaritan. That being said, that is a very limited sort of portion of how the neighbor gets treated, and from that point on, you see a lot of various sorts of abstractions and representations of how ethics works in the context of the early Reformation. First of all, you can see in the way that people speak about the love of the neighbor, the sort of responsibilities one perceives to have towards the people who are not in the church, perceived by yourself. So if you're a Protestant, the way that you're supposed to approach the Catholics or the heretics, the Anabaptists, and so on and so forth. And so you have people like the radical reformers, like Andreas Karlstadt, who is warning that you have to be careful which sort of neighbors you love, because the Bible warns you about loving people that are going to push you away from the love of God. And so you only have to love the neighbors that really get you close to God. There's contrast to that in Zwingli, for example, who seems to be using the neighbor as a distinction from the brother. And if the brother is the person who's in the church and does what you do, the neighbor are people who can be evil or sinful, and you nevertheless have to love them. So you can see sort of differences in ethical frameworks in the 16th century through the neighbor. The most important sort of distinction I cared about is the scope. So the possible geographical expansion of the neighbor to people you may never have met in the past. And you have very proximate language of the neighbor, for example, in Luther, where I will get back to this, but you have Luther speaking about neighbor love as something that is happening quite parochially. You have to not gossip about your neighbor. You have to, when he speaks about it quite persistently, it is about how you treat the person who's right next to you. In contrast, you have things like the Peasants' War of 1525, political upheaval that followed immediately after the Reformation, where the peasants suggested that the gospel has to reimagine how we see our societies, and so they wanted to reorganize a society that had no more lordship and sometimes no more private possessions and things of the sort, in the name of the love of neighbor. So they wanted the love of neighbor to be the sort of fundamental legal principle around which you form your society. And so at that point, the neighbor, rather than being someone who's literally next to you, is anyone who's within the same sovereign sort of legal construct is used. So in the Holy Roman Empire for most of the peasants. So you have a neighbor that is sort of similar to the citizen. You can see that in Melanchthon as well, who is describing love of neighbor as equivalent to the keeping of the peace. But what sort of interested me and where I wanted to dig deeper was the case study of Luther's language of proximity and quite literal definition of the neighbor, similar to what's happening in Wycliffe and things of the sort. And what I tended to realize was that there's a polemical element to that at the beginning. But in order to describe sort of broadly how Luther uses the neighbor, as I was saying, you have the notion, for example, he describes the Sermon on the Mount as a summary of the ways that you ought to be, that the Bible teaches you ought to be friendly towards your neighbor. And the descriptions place the neighbor in a list with a husband, a wife, and this is a clumsy English translation because you cannot do anything else there, but the husband, the wife, the child, the neighbor, and the neighbor as in the aproapele. And so you have this very limited notion. It's a person you know. It's a person you don't really have any familial ties with, but is around you. And you're supposed to not gossip around them. You're supposed to confront their sins in private. So it's clearly a person that's right next to you. There's caveats to that, where neighborhood can work sort of differently for other people. So for example, the Pope is mistreating his Bohemian neighbors when he's not wanting to restitute their church property to them, which means that the Pope has as his neighbor sort of anyone whom he's not met, but is underneath him within the ecclesiological structure, the same way a judge is grieving about the suffering he's imposing on his guilty neighbor that needs to be punished, but needs to love his neighbor enough to sort of punish him and take care of the other neighbors. And so a judge has as his neighbors all the people he judges over, and then magistrates and soldiers have to be going and punishing and fighting people and doing violence in the name of the love of the neighbor. So if you have a secular political office, once again, the people who are your subjects are your neighbors. So you have these sorts of abstractions. The other one that I found much more interesting, since we are just a couple of decades after 7 decades, I guess, after the invention of the printing press, when he's writing, he starts to describe his readers as his neighbors. So he's talking about his responsibility, his sort of authority to have opinions about whether priests can marry and things of the sort. And he's saying, well, I don't have any sort of ecclesiastical office that allows me to say this, but I have a Christian duty towards my neighbor to give them advice. And so the people who are reading his books are now his neighbor. And so you have this sort of celebrity popularity culture that we would tend to associate with modernity, where a celebrity sort of sees themselves as connected to people he's never met through the medium of print or something of the sort. And yet this is happening quite immediately after the invention of the printing press. So you have largely proximate sort of parochial definition of the neighbor in Luther, with some caveats. But the thing that sort of studying this as a sort of prehistory to what I wanted to study, which was a longer sort of view through the 16th century, I stopped onto a aspect of the 16th century that ended up sort of devouring the rest of my dissertation, and that has become the sort of center of what was happening, which was the indulgence controversy, which, as I came to realize, had sort of a debate over who my neighbor is at the center of it, something that I did not see studied virtually anywhere. So to give a sort of broad notion of what the indulgence controversy is, it was the thing that made Luther, for the first time, a famous sort of writer within the context of the both Humanist Republic of Letters to some extent, and also very much so in the German-speaking world. He complained about indulgences. The standard account would be that he complained about indulgences as a form of corruption within the Catholic Church, as a form of selling salvation which should be free, as a preaching of something that doesn't have any biblical scriptural basis, and as something that was an overreach of papal authority over purgatory. Presumably indulgences were saying that people can be rescued from their punishment in purgatory, and supposedly this didn't work with Luther's theology. The core text that people sort of see with regard to the indulgence controversy are the 95 Theses. Now, the thing is, if you look closer at the indulgence controversy, while the 95 Theses were in some aspects an important document, they are, first of all, not the primary sort of statement of what Luther thinks about this thing, because it's a series of 95 theses that are stated with various sort of levels of intensity and polemicism. They're also not printed in a very large sort of number of letters. What happens afterwards, though, since he becomes involved in a polemic with some of the bishops and archbishops in the area, is that he decides to go to print with another pamphlet, something called the Sermon on Indulgences and Grace, which comes in 1518, so 1 year after the printing of the, well, a few months, I guess, after the publication or not publication of the 95 Theses. And this is the document that really makes Luther famous. So within the first year, there's 15 different editions of the little pamphlet that get printed. It gets exploded. All of the printers that start printing print too little. Immediately, everything gets sold out, and then they need to print more and more. And this is the thing that really is Luther's first print success. And so if you look at this, this is the place that I think is quite central to look at, and the thing that gave me quite a bit on neighbor love. So what the Sermon on the Indulgences and Grace is first of all not quite a sermon. It's a list of 20 theses that are indeed addressed to a lay audience rather than a theological audience. And so he starts by explaining how the theology of penance works in the Catholic Church, and he describes that in order to be saved, forgiven your sins, you first of all have to be contrite, so you have to feel bad about your sins. Then you have to partake in confession and confess your sins to a priest. And then you have to do works of satisfaction in order to amend for the sins you have made and heal yourself in regard to the sins you have made. Then he separates satisfaction into 3 parts. Again, you need to pray about your sins, you need to fast about your sins, and then you need to do almsgiving, which he describes as anything that is to do with the love and charity towards one's neighbor. And then after he explains this sort of thing to a lay audience, he says the only thing that indulgences do away with are this last part of it. So the only thing that you do away with an indulgence is loving your neighbor and doing good things about them. So we need to stop doing this. Now, I will caveat this by saying the Reformation ideas that people usually impose on it, something to do the question of the scriptural basis of this framework, the question of the papal authority over purgatory and things of the sort. They are there in this pamphlet, but they are not conclusive. He mentions them sort of in passing. This might be a problem. This is not quite in the Bible, or at least I don't see it. Nevertheless, even if it's in the Bible, we have a problem. This is most of how the Reformation ideas tend to function in the pamphlet. And then I will give the first sort of quote that I think is quite representative, which is where I think his sort of thesis for the pamphlet comes in, which is, even if the Christian church decrees that indulgence teaching and all these claims are correct, it would still be 1,000 times better that a Christian does not desire indulgences, but prefer to do the works and bear the suffering that they would do away with, because indulgences are nothing else but the living inside of the good works and useful suffering on a Christian's journey. And so, first of all, the whole pamphlet sort of functions on the idea of doing good works versus indulgences. And the winner over here is the doing of the good works. What is more interesting to my question of abstraction of the neighbor is what comes afterwards, which is the following quote. It is much better for a work to be done for a needy person than the money be given to a building or any sort of cause that an indulgence is raising money for. Should you wish to give anything, you should first give it to your poor neighbor before all other things, without regard for the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome or indulgences. But if it is the case that there is no one in your town that needs help, and I don't know why I erased the essential next bit, which is God willing, that will never happen. As in the absurd case where there's no one needy in your town, then give it, if you wish, to the church's altars, ornaments, and chalices in your town. And when this is also not needed, only then, if you should wish, may you give it to St. Peter's or elsewhere. So there's a clear hierarchization where your responsibilities as a Christian are local, and only when there's nothing to do in your local community can you even ponder having any sort of responsibility towards places elsewhere. So there's this hierarchy of the local and then everything else. Now, the question would be what this has to do with indulgences and sort of the notion of paying money and doing away with penance. Well, there's recent literature that sort of reconstruct the way that indulgences work in the Middle Ages, and the main sort of function of indulgences is precisely that of being able to create solidarity and charity over wider spans of space and things of the sort. So the original cause of indulgences was to be able to give the people who might die in crusades a way to do away with their penance and know that they are not going to get to purgatory because they weren't able to do the penance. If you go and die for Christianity within a crusade, then that counts as your penance, you're fine. That is the origin. Then it gets expanded to dangerous sort of works of piety like pilgrimages to Rome and especially Jerusalem and things of the sort. And then they get increasingly expanded to the point where in the 15th and 16th century, they're essentially ubiquitous, both in scope, as in you have the large sort of indulgences that are given by the Pope. You also have local indulgences that a priest could request from a bishop or something of the sort. And they have there a list of indulgence purposes, of sort of works that you can do in order to get an indulgence. You can have a priest get an indulgence in order for his parish to participate in a certain mass, funeral, or something of the sort, for helping a needy person whose house burned down or something like that, or even for praying for the church. You could request something like that from a bishop, and then you get the indulgence, and then you tell people in your parish community, participate in these works of local piety, and you'll get this indulgence. These, according to the medieval scholars that are researching indulgences in the medieval time as a social historical sort of phenomenon, are supposedly the most common indulgences. From there, you can get to the regional indulgences, which are the first ones that we know a bit better, because there's some excellent sources about them. And these are regional sort of things. So a church burns down in a town, the town does not have enough money to repair that church. And so they go to a bishop or even more bishops and collect indulgences in order for them to be able to go to other towns and tell them, we need money to restore our church, we need money to repair our hospital, we had a plague, etc. We have these sort of monetary concern and we need money for you to be able to get back on track. We got an indulgence. If you help us with this, this is going to count to you as a good work of restitution with regard to your sins, and so you don't have to do the penance you were supposed to be doing. Beyond that, you have transregional sort of causes that tend to already involve the Pope. You have cathedrals especially, and sort of places of great importance, or for example, the Livonian Crusade, that get preached into much wider sort of territories that largely get mapped onto sort of linguistically homogeneous sort of places. So the Constance Cathedral, for example, tends to get preached around the Holy Roman Empire. The Livonian Crusade, which is at the end of the Holy Roman Empire, tends to be preached in the Holy Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. And so you start to have this sort of association of yourself with first your community, is the argument I'm trying to make, with your region to some extent, and you get exposed to causes in your region coming to your town to advertise for your money. Then you have the transregional sort of frameworks within the Holy Roman Empire, and sometimes a bit more distant. So the Santes Cathedral, which is associated with Charlemagne, is a very important church in France. And so they get quite a bit of indulgence. And the indulgence campaign is run by this guy called Raymond Peraudi, who's the great innovator of the indulgence trade. And he manages to make a great deal out of it. And this gets preached almost throughout Christendom. And so you start to get an idea of churches in France and so on and so forth. The final and sort of most powerful scope of the indulgence trade still remains that has to do with Rome. So sort of indulgences that come from Rome and expand through the whole of Christendom. And you have, for example, the Order of the Holy Spirit that has a hospital in Rome, and they get the permission to go and ask for funding throughout Christendom. You have the Turkish Crusades. The Turkish had only just landed in Venice, and for example, that sends a plenary indulgence within Christianity, within the whole of Christendom. A plenary indulgence means all of the sins that you have to make penance for are at once done away with, not the sins but the punishment. And then finally, the most important indulgence crusade, and the thing that sort of exploded the whole Reformation phenomenon, was the raising of money for the St. Peter's Basilica, which was just being started to be preached within the proximity of Saxony at the time. Now, the other sort of thing that is quite central to my claim of people being exposed to these sort of outer, far distant sort of the duties that they have towards Christendom, or people far away from their community through indulgences, come also with the fact that indulgences get genuinely ubiquitous. So, for example, Peraudi, the guy that I mentioned earlier, starts organizing jubilees, which is the festivals where you can get plenary indulgences, throughout Christendom at the beginning of the 16th century, and he starts organizing them within all towns up to 500 people. And so these are quite medium level towns in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And what it means is not only that you get access to the people in these towns, but you have your core in the 500 person town. And from there, you start advertising in the neighborhood. So it is really, truly expansive. The other sort of evidence that everyone knew and was exposed to these indulgence campaigns is the print orders that we have for the indulgence the letters of the 15th century. And if a genuine print hit in the 16th century, something like Letter to the Christian Nobility of Martin Luther and something like that, becomes a hit by reaching something like a print number of 20,000 copies or something like that, indulgences could get printed up to 250,000 copies in one campaign. And so if you're reaching far more than just the literate elite or anything like that. You're really printing to reach virtually everyone by the beginning of the 16th century. And so from that on, my dissertation starts to look through the indulgence campaign and sort of see how people are exposed to these causes, and whether, as Luther says, they're exposed to them as works or simply just a transaction of forgiving sins or something of the sort. Now, the other sort of question is how common people get exposed to indulgences and how that sort of forms their mental imagery of space and their sort of geographical scope of responsibility. And it seems to me quite clear that these indulgence campaigns are sort of overhauling any sort of notion of a parochial existence of common people in the context of an indulgence being preached, which is when you're looking at, for example, the preaching of the St. Peter's campaign. If you look at the instructionals, you see what they ask their preachers and the organizers to do, which is every church service in a certain span of where the indulgence preaching gets done gets canceled. You do not have any other services. You do not have any other indulgences or things of the sort. And a priest gets excommunicated if they do not advertise the preaching of that particular indulgence. And so you have this advertising happen. And then all of the people from quite significant amounts of towns in the neighborhood of where the indulgence gets preached are requested to come in to the central sort of place where the indulgence gets preached, and then be exposed to the preaching of what is happening. And so the question at this point becomes, are they exposed to a preaching of you have many sins, we can forgive them, or is it a question of them being told they're responsible to do a good work towards something that they cannot see, that is far away, that is formed within the scope of an abstract community? And I have here sort of the language of the St. Peter's campaign that it gets addressed first to the organizers and then to the people. And so you see in the bull that organizes the preaching through Saxony and the neighboring areas, the Pope says the help of all Christian faithful is required for the public decorum and dignity of the Commonwealth. And so you have a responsibility for how Christianity looks to the outer world. We need to be conscious of how Christianity looks. Rome is the image of Christianity, and you have to contribute to the great functioning of Rome. Then further, if you look at the instructional documents of Albrecht of Mainz, whose name I apparently didn't put wholly there, he addresses the preachers and emphasizes that they need to tell the people that for such a moderate contribution, as in not that much money, to such a necessary work as in the building of St. Peter's, the building of the building of the Prince of the Apostles in the city. So you have the language of Rome and Rome's importance being exposed to people who are largely illiterate and supposed to live a rather parochial life. And then we have an example sermon by Johann Tetzel, who's the guy who Luther really gets angry at. And at the beginning of the sort of example sermon that he gives, he starts with, you have Rome in your city. Your church has become St. Peter's in Rome, and your priests, the apostolic penitentiaries. And so you have this metaphorical language that that locality has transformed itself in and of itself into Rome by the fact that you can get the same indulgences you could previously get in Rome here in your town. So you clearly have this sort of idea that you're belonging in a society that's much larger than yourself. And so what my dissertation is trying to do is expose all of these sort of frameworks in which indulgences create in the mind of common people an idea that they belong to their region, first of all, to Christendom, to something like the Holy Roman Empire or the nation or something like that, and then to their locality, and they have to choose by just where they're going to spend their money on indulgences, to which one their allegiance is stronger. And so you have these sort of abstractions that are this sort of public sphere with competing abstract communities that I'm trying to reconstruct within the indulgence trade. Now, if we look into the case study of Luther earlier, in order to see where this sort of notion of locality comes from as a sort of rhetorical tool, first of all, we see that this is not always his critique of indulgences. He critiques indulgences over the 3 or 4 years prior to this pamphlet becoming famous in very different sort of ways. First of all, there is the sort of works thing over there. He says that the church is using too much of the treasury of merit, but not contributing to it, as in people are not doing enough good works. They're endangering people's salvation by giving a notion of security. You do have the local sort of stuff of people abandoning their local lowly works and then going for proud works of building churches because they heard that the saints were doing so and now they want to do the same. Then complaints that are sort of more generic about indulgences. They're telling us that we give money for a certain cause and then they use it for other nonsense we don't even know about. And then he throws the blame for the indulgence trade on all sorts of things. What is interesting to me is that when he goes to print, when he's addressing a lay audience, the sort of rhetorical direction he decides to take, the rhetorical gamble he does, is to set all of that aside and go to locality as his sort of token critique. And then that pays off greatly. He becomes a sort of celebrity in the German-speaking world of which there was none the like before. Now, there's the language of locality present in his discourse in other places, but indulgences before, which is in his critiques of pilgrimages, especially. So he's complaining about pilgrimages as something that are undoing the central place of the parish in the Christian life. So when people are going on pilgrimages, they are going for proud, sort of distinct works that they think are more special than living your life in your parish. And then he has this sort of continuum of pilgrimages, from the big ones that we know of, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and so on and so forth, that presumably only wealthy people go to. And he goes down to the not orthodox sort of small local pilgrimages that tend to happen around the area. So cults of saints that might be animals and things of the sort. There's a whole sort of literature in the 70s on the popular religion of early modernity and the sort of unaccepted local saints that are not really validated by the Vatican, and you are going to sort of miracle working places in the villages, in the mountains, where some sort of peculiar preacher gets preaching various sorts of things. For Luther, these are actually quite connected to witches' Sabbaths and so on and so forth. And the discourse he's having throughout his critique of this is everything from these sort of things that the Vatican hates, which are the local sort of things, the local feast days and things of the sort, all the way to pilgrimages to Rome. It's the same devil at work, which he says should be exorcised by beatings, because the people who are most affected by this demon are wives and servants of the people you can actually beat. And so clearly, when he's talking about this sort of somewhat cosmopolitan, definitely not parochial way of leaving your town and abandoning your local duties in order to go elsewhere, he's not talking about elites, he's talking about servants and wives and people who he looks down upon. So he sees this as a problem of everyone. Usually people sort of get away with this by describing this as a sort of anti-clerical sort of thing. He's complaining about priests and higher-ups that are undermining the parish, but he's clearly not, because he's blaming the devils that are confusing the local people. He otherwise is blaming the priests that are not going to their parishes and so on and so forth. So the blame is happening everywhere within this sort of critique of locality in a way that really has very little to do with anti-clericalism or any sort of excuse of this not being a sort of ideological emphasis on locality as a choice that should be made by people, as opposed to sort of a cosmopolitan way of life. So this is the sort of thing I'm trying to reconstruct, the notion that locality can be one of the choices in the 16th century, and that it is within the public sphere of the 16th century quite a persuasive rhetorical tool that manages to give Luther the sort of rhetorical and print and popularity power to become Reformer Martin Luther. Then locality once again remains an essential part of his discourse later, and in his major hit, even bigger than the one that I spoke so far, that comes in 1520, the letter to the Christian nobility, he says the following: rather than pilgrimages, God has commanded that man should take care of his wife and children, perform the duties of a husband, and serve and help his neighbor. Today, a man makes a pilgrimage to Rome and spends 50, maybe 100 gulden, something nobody commanded him to do. He permits his wife and child and his neighbor at any rate to suffer back home. And then if a man wants to do a good work, such as go on a pilgrimage, let his priest and master show him how to use his money and effort for pilgrimage, for God's commandments, for works 1,000 times better by spending it on his own family and on his poor neighbors at home later. And then once again, let the saints canonize themselves, and let every man stay in his own parish. There he will find more than all the saints. In his own parish, you will find baptism, the sacrament, preaching, and your neighbor. So once again, locality is quite central to Luther's discourse. To give sort of conclusions to this side of my talk, once again, I mentioned the notion of locality not being the same as anti-clericalism or anything of the sort. You also see the rhetoric of locality in print sort of persistent. The indulgence controversy becomes about something else and becomes about papal authority, but that is largely because that is what Luther gets confronted upon. So when Luther becomes famous with his critiques, the small elements of criticizing papal authority are the things that his critics know they can most immediately attack him on and do away with him. And so the debate just becomes about that, but it is not really the original center of the debate. And then while this is happening and Luther in his theological polemics starts speaking about other stuff than locality, the devotional literature of early Protestantism continues to have the language of locality quite persistent when addressing the common people. Now, why am I calling it a rhetoric and not just a theological stance of Luther? Is the second half of my dissertation, which remains still speculative. So I'm just going to be describing what I'm going to be working on from now on without being particularly definitive on what's happening. But the thing is, soon after this sort of language of nothing outside your town matters is just proud sort of pretenses of thinking about other stuff, immediately after, the Protestant discourse that continues to have locality as a sort of the burgeoning tool over there or like as a powerful rhetorical tool, starts speaking about Germany and the nation quite persistently. You have on the right, I guess, an image of Luther being painted as the Hercules Germanicus in 1519. So immediately after this is happening. So Luther fighting on behalf of the Germans against the Roman tyranny and so on and so forth. And then I just have some examples, but I think I should be moving quickly through them. You see the language of Germany within Luther's and many other reformers' language quite persistently. And so the question comes, the question rises of how can you say at the same time nothing outside your village matters, but at the same time speaking about Germany as if it's an immediate and sort of concrete reality to all the people you're addressing. And so since I am speaking about something that according to historians should not exist, there's going to be some discourse on what on earth they mean by the nation. Of course, I'm not implying they mean what the 19th century people are meaning by nation, or that there's something inherent in it. But there is sort of a linguistic explanation of what's happening. Maybe Luther, because he's a famous German language printer, maybe it has to do with linguistics, but at the same time that is disqualified by the fact, for example, that the Swiss reformers do not go the route of the nation. They do not speak about Switzerland as opposed to the German ones. So then that implicitly would push you towards an explanation of the nation as a sort of political entity. So the Holy Roman Empire is the nation. There's caveats to that as well, because you can see Luther complaining about the Bohemians within the Holy Roman Empire as proud and fighting the Teutons and the Germans. And so you have something that goes further than that. You have an ethnic explanation of what the nation can mean, also complicated by various sorts of things. And then the true mystery of what the nation is in terms of theology and Luther's theology that strikes me is the fact that there's really no connection between how their churches are organized and the nation. There's no German church at this time. There's churches that are associated to territorial states over there. So Luther's church is a Saxon church. Johannes Brent's church is a Württembergish church, and so on and so forth. All of the little states in the Holy Roman Empire have their own churches, and yet they barely speak about Saxony, Württemberg, and so on and so forth. They speak about Germany. So there's something that clearly seems to be quite inherent in their sort of ideological framing of the world that makes them sort of emphasize Germany at the detriment of all of these other things. And now people have started sort of writing literature on what the nation is and its existence in late medieval sort of times and early modernity. Kaspar Hirschi is a Swiss scholar that works on this. He's describing the nation and nationalist sort of discourse as a construct of the humanist the writers, which seems quite plausible to me, and also seems to me the place where Luther tends to take this, because Luther in his very early print tends to imitate Erasmus quite a lot, to the point of just copying phrasings from his books. And Erasmus is, I would argue, one of the first within print to really theologize the concept of the nation. He's, for example, in The Praise of Folly, describing the sort of particular sins of various sorts of nations, and then he's describing the pride of self-love, of appreciating yourself more than the others within terms of nations. So the Franks think they're superior to the Germans, the English think they're superior to the Franks, and so on and so forth. And this is the sin of loving yourself more than others. And so you see that sort of coming into Luther and becoming a rather visceral sort of thing. So what my project is going to try to do is, first of all, understand how the sort of theologization, like how the nation, which for the humanists largely tends to be a secular concept, how it becomes a very religious sort of entity within the thought of early Protestantism, and at the same time to see how it functions from genre to genre. So what I decided to do is to take a quantitative rather than qualitative approach, which is what the first half of my dissertation is doing, and to sort of look through as much of the text that I can in the beginning of the 16th century and quantify how much they speak about the nation versus how much they speak about the region, locality, and Christendom. The problem is 16th century language is orthographically chaos. And so you cannot really do this with searching for words and things of the sort, because every single word is spelled 50 different ways. And so I have now a tool at my disposal that is quite extraordinary at that, despite its bad fame in academia for reasonable reasons, which is ChatGPT or large language models. ChatGPT in particular has been trained quite extensively on early modern language, and it's able to parse and even translate things quite well. There's been there's been papers published on its competence in doing this sort of thing. And so my project is going to be taking the majority of the corpora of theological texts in the early 16th century. It's going to be handing them in little chunks to ChatGPT, and it's going to ask the algorithm to give me a database of all of these references, of all of these geographical and ethnonymical and toponymical references, through which I can then go analyze by hand and then create sort of analytical analyses of how much this is happening over the years, how much the nation sort of makes a sway in when it happens in relationship to what it happens, and how it differs, for example, from theologians in Switzerland to theologians in Germany, and so on and so forth. And so I will be getting a database that looks largely like this, that I will have to go and correct by hand. And then on top of that, I will be able to sort of write my also qualitative analysis of what the nation means in terms of theology and what its peculiar relationship is to locality, and why seemingly the early Protestants seem to continue saying nothing but the town matters, but at the same time think about the nation as if the two are somehow compatible. Yeah, I will just leave it here, I think, at the moment. And if there are questions and things of the sort, I will be happy to hear your thoughts.
Yes, if I may. The practice of indulgences was a rather global Christian practice, because there are cases of indulgences also being released in Orthodox Church. There are cases and examples, rather late ones, I would say, and also polemics against this this practice in the Roman Catholic Church. But the polemics are regarding, as usual, papal authority. So not only the Bishop of Rome should give these letters of absolution, but also Eastern Patriarch, so to say. So the practice is a rather spread one, but also I was thinking. So in reading to my knowledge, there are no discussions on such fine matters, social matters that you present today in these Eastern Orthodox examples. But maybe there is something interesting also to be found in this. So I should point to Professor Nikolaos Chrysidis from Southern Connecticut State University, that he did some work on this, on research on the Eastern Orthodox letters of absolution or indulgences. I don't know. So if they are so relevant to your question and to your framing and to your research question, but I think you should also look into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have not pondered their existence in the Eastern Church largely at all. And I would imagine there's not, within the literature as opposed to the reality of the critiques of indulgences. So within the literature on indulgences, in general, the social critiques are really not taken into account with relationship to the Catholic world at all, not because they're not there. For example, Wycliffe makes a very similar sort of critique of indulgences to Luther's that really no one pays attention to, because the really powerful polemical sort of thing that is happening, and the sort of insecurity as well of most theologians. So when theologians are speaking about indulgences, quite generally they're speaking about how you make indulgences work, because it's a theologically sort of peculiar phenomenon. And so everything from the scholastic literature to most of the people who are doing indulgence campaigns, they are very much concerned with sort of figuring out how to make the notion that you're taking people out of purgatory, whether the Pope has the authority over purgatory to be able to dismiss their sentence or so on and so forth. So that's the thing that really interests theologians, whereas the social critiques, such as Luther and so on and so forth, tend to be happening on another level that has not really been studied that much. And so most of the literature on indulgences tends to still be oriented towards either the penance sort of structure of it and sort of evaluate the theology, or to do the political sort of question of where is the corruption. Much of what's happening on the St. Peter's campaign is discussing sort of the hidden motives of Albrecht of Mainz, who's the archbishop in Luther's area at the time, and how he was doing this in order to pay off his debts to the Fuggers, so the money that made him be able to sneak himself into a role he was not allowed to be in technically because he was too young for it, and so on and so forth. So much of the literature really focuses on that, and locality doesn't really come into this. While I've started to work on this, I've realized that the English medievalists have just recently started looking into this. I've mentioned a few of them over there because they're interested in the social workings of indulgences, and a lot of them tend to be sort of Catholic historians that are trying to give indulgences a better name. So that's the impetus of what's happening over there. But at the same time, they start to sort of discuss whether indulgences are really that much of an overreach over the life of the church and so on and so forth. And so I would expect that if there is sort of large enough use of indulgences in the Eastern Church, someone would probably have ended up in this debate and historians would not have looked at it. So there's certainly something to be looked at over there. And so if my languages can handle it, I'd be very curious to look into it. Yeah, thank you for the question. For the reference to the professor you mentioned, I did not know about him, so I'll be looking into him.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. Inspiring, I'm saying this because the framework that you suggest for the reading of the matter of indulgences, I noticed while listening to you that this framework of the language of locality is applicable to the entire Lutheran thought, the Lutheran writings. As for example, it reminded me of the Large Catechism, where in the Large Catechism he comments the commandment, the seventh commandment that says, "Thou shalt not steal." First of all, by suggesting a transition from these abstract bad words to very actual deeds in your community and in your immediate neighborhood. As we have just said, to steal is not only to rob our neighbors' coffers and pockets, but to be too far reaching in the market, in all stores and shops, wine and beer sellers. Mm-hmm. And then what is interesting, very similar to what you presented in terms of indulgences, here in commenting this commandment, he says, "Yet, what would become of the head and supreme protector of all thieves, the holy chair at Rome?" So what is far from your neighborhood is the incarnation of this abstract deed that is a bad deed. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. The way that historians, many of whom are Lutheran, have dealt with this sort of language over there is to emphasize how pastoral and caring Luther is and how much he understands about the life of the people he's writing to. And the catechisms are written for the common man, for the simple folk, in order to understand what the religion is about. And so they're saying, oh, this is Luther just trying to emphasize how you work. The problem, that is the absurd sort of thing that is happening over here that is making me clearly see that there's ideologization of the very sort of vernacular common man sort of public sphere. He's preaching about this sort of stuff to people who you would imagine don't really care about that. And it's the Pope, and they presumably have some sort of notion of the Pope and vaguely a choice whether they want to be loyal to the Pope or not. So there might be something practicable in what he's doing there, even though there isn't, because if you're in Saxony in 1530, you're not Catholic. And the other thing that is, I think, more emphatic is he's complaining in the same way about the Anabaptists and about all of the people he's already exiled from the Saxony at the time. So he's constructing this sort of boogeyman of the Pope and the Anabaptists and so on and so forth that keep coming back in, as well as the news in his preaching. And so he goes into the pulpit and talks to people about things that are really not practicable at all. So the notion that this is just pastoral honesty is rather implausible, because there's all of these other sort of things. So there's clearly a rhetoric of locality that they really dwell on, but at the same time, this sort of the non-locality as a nasty thing that has to be coming to you, but at the same time that sort of eats up the preoccupation of what you're doing when you're addressing presumably the common man and not print. And presumably one of the reasons for this is that Luther sees himself quite emphatically as God's man in print, essentially. He sees his role in print as quite essential. And so it seems to me that oftentimes when he's preaching, he knows that his sermon is going to go to print and end up outside of Saxony. And so he is preaching, but at the same time, he's writing print and just exercising. Well, to the extent to which we know what he actually says in the church, because just because it says is what he says, he said in the church does not necessarily mean it really is there. But with things like the catechism, those are clearly addressed to the common man, and it's him sort of creating these sort of ideological constructs that are very much remote from the people's parochial context.
Yeah. So I quoted on purpose from something else that you for your presentation, because it seems to me a proof that this language of locality functions really as a rhetorical program,
yeah,
as you suggest.
As polemics. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your excellent contribution to our seminar. And I wonder if you have identified already some signs of humanistic influence on early Luther's writings about nation.
Yes. So as I was saying, it doesn't seem to me that the nation makes all that much sense to what is happening in their context, which the Swiss scholar I mentioned, Hirschi, sort of alludes to at one point, that there is this sort of functioning of nationalist language within the humanistic context that has nothing to do with the actual politics. The politics are not nationalist or national in any way, but at the same time, the nationalist language gives you the illusion that you're involved, that this is in some sort of way participative, and so it gives you the impetus to talk and fight over it, and so on and so forth. And so it seems to me that that's the only really explanation of why Luther would be making that much of the nation, that there is something sort of they inherit as intrinsic in some sort of way. Because if you see the nation as a sort of sovereign institution, so if you see it as a Holy Roman Empire, it is somewhat important, but at the same time, Charles V wanted him dead, and he wasn't dead, which means that the Saxon principality was quite strong enough to really get him going. He could have focused on that. Charles was really not that strong at the time. There's also all of these other things and again, the church gets organized on a regional level, and none of them seem to be thinking of speaking about the region all that much. They just jump to the nation. And then when you look at how they jump to the nation, it seems intrinsic and sort of tied to the ethnical stereotypes that have a clear origin, which is the humanists. And I think that lately there's been too little really spoken about how people like Erasmus and people of the sort have really shaped the early Protestant rhetoric. But I think the nation, the way that they use the concept of the nation, does not look like the sort of administrative thing that sort of happens at Rome or something like that. It doesn't look like anything else but what the humanists are doing. But at the same time, there's a distinction, which is for most of the humanists, what they look at is Rome and Greece. It is largely a secular sort of concept that is not really the nation, for example, of the 19th century, that is very much spiritual, that is related to Israel, that has like it's God's thoughts for humanity and so on and so forth. It seems to me that the early Protestants are the people who sort of sneak the theology into it by just seeing the connections between the nation, which is now the sort of core of the new church in some ways, like for example, for England, it is, and then by some sort of peculiar stretch of the imagination in Germany as well, even though it's not, as I was mentioning, but you start having this association of sovereign politics with like the ultimate sort of secular authority. And then that gets connected to the church in some sort of way because the church is there. And so you have these little Israels that are getting formed of all of the nations. And so you start being able to apply something that they initially reject. So early Protestant rhetoric, before they have complete political control, tends to say, you cannot, as a secular ruler, look at what Israel's rulers were doing and apply it because you're not Israel, you're Germany. That's a distinct sort of thing. And within the New Testament, all of these promises and commandments of Israel get spiritualized. And so you don't kill the heretics, you kill the heretic within you. But then later, they start bringing it back in. And I don't think it's just cynicism. I just think it's them being clumsy with these concepts, and the nation just immediately sliding into the place that the disappearance of Christendom in their mind sort of makes open. So you have Christendom as a sort of political entity in the late medieval period that is the church's sphere, and the Pope is half a secular ruler, half a spiritual ruler. And so you have this sort of image of the Christian world that is both palpable and sort of spiritual and so on and so forth. And you have the body of Christ associated with a political sort of entity. And then when they break that political entity, that disappears, and you have a vacuum over there that you either decide should be there, like the Anabaptists, and say, no, this is a spiritual sort of thing. Or if you're a magisterial reformer and you use the magistrates to make your church happen, then something like the magistrates have to fit in there. And because Israel is a quasi-national entity, then that tends to sort of combine with the humanist secular thing and produce, at least slowly by the 19th century, the sort of quasi-spiritual formation of the nation that we're familiar with, that inherits a lot from Christianity. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, if I may, a second. Sorry.
Please.
Yeah.
Yes. If I may, a second thought about your dissertation and the difficulties of it and the methodological difficulties. So you have on the one side to focus not only and not specifically on the revolutionary in Luther's works, but also on the continuities with the medieval frame of mind. This is one thing, and the other you have to surgically cut the distinction between the nationalist language and the nationalist ideologies, which were imposed on Luther's in the many number of monographies on Luther in the eve of nationalist and German nationalist even national socialist agendas. So it's how would you operate these surgical distinctions? Also thinking that maybe text generated and artificial intelligence might not very clearly distinguish between such fine ideological frames of interpretation.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very useful question. And I think one of the things that draws me to the project as such. So the notion of Luther as a nationalist was, as you say, quite central to the ideology of German nationalism before the Nazis and then with the Nazis as well. And then it just disappeared completely. But not only the notion of Luther as a nationalist, which is nonsensical in the context of 19th century and 20th century ideology, there's nothing that fits on their sort of ideology. But at the same time, they make this appear in order to sort of avoid the danger of doing what the Nazis are doing. Just all of the nation, it just gets surgically cut from everything on the 16th century. And there's people who are much closer rhetorically to the ideology, like deceivingly close. Obviously, they're not saying the same thing, but you have people like the Ulrich von Hutten and people like that who are speaking about fighting and dying for the fatherland and so on and so forth. And the nation is really the central sort of element in Hutten's thought. There was virtually no book on the Reformation before the sort of fall of the nationalist view of the middle of early modernity that did not mention Hutten. Now, essentially, there's no book that mentions him at all, and they just make the nation kind of disappear completely from the language. And then if someone mentions the nation, the response is, yeah, but it doesn't mean the same thing as in the 19th century. And so that's where my dissertation tries to come in. And first of all, use AI just to say, I'm not letting AI tell me what it means in any sort of way. I just have a database that gives me just a quantitative demonstration that the nation is so prevalent over there that we need to know what on earth it means. So if it doesn't mean what it means in the 19th and 20th century, which I very much agree with, then we have to actually speak about it, because the only people who actually speak about the nation in the 16th century are the nationalists. And so they have not only the last word, but essentially the only word on the subject. And that's not a reasonable state, a historiographical state to be in. And so what I try to do at that point is one of my pet projects, which is historiographical sort of discussion within my work. And so instead of just writing about what the nation means in the 16th century in the sort of intellectual historical element of it, that bit of my dissertation is going to be half how the liberals and the post-nationalists sort of describe it or don't describe it, how the nationalists sort of misinterpret it, and where that leaves us and what we can do with it. So it's very much a dialogue with historians of the 20s and 30s and so on and so forth, because that's the only way you can approach it. But I would argue it's a necessary thing to do. The nation is there. Someone has to be speaking about it and giving some sort of non-ideologically nationalist account of what on earth it is, no matter what it is. But I don't really have the conclusions of that chapter, which I haven't yet started working on. So, alas. No.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a small comment and one question, perhaps. If you allow me, I would first of all place the problem, your problem, within
a bit larger context, if not the largest possible, which I think is the most powerful abstraction, which is the monetary one, and it is very much involved in the concept of indulgences and as practiced by the Catholic thinkers, theologians, entrepreneurs of indulgences, etc., all across the Holy Roman Empire. And the other limit, which would be that variety of Protestant thinking, which equates wealth with virtue. Because between this framework is, there are two seas or mass of lands which were responsible for the idea of money. which is perhaps one of the finest abstraction of the human mind, because all of us, we are participating in accepting that this or that may value precisely that amount, a number, etc. This is one of the most fascinating things in the history of mankind, to accept without any possible contradiction that a certain coin would value precisely that amount of whatever value you allow to infuse through a very abstract procedure, and in the opposite direction, to see that the accumulation of wealth is a proof or a direction of virtue in terms of eschatology, even, because your own data belong to one of the most, how shall I put it, intense period in the history of religions. Not only because it produced one more Christianity within the history of Christianity, not only because it really transformed Europe, not only because it produced one of the best music in the world, not only because it helped everybody understand differently the religions of others. This Wittenberg period of 1517, the 1905 thesis, etc. But it was so influential, as we know, way beyond Benedict Anderson, through the works of Hans-Georg Kippenberg, of Gige Daleacus Trumsa, that this was the most instrumental in the nascence of a comparative history of religions. Because all the cognitive apparatus of doing comparative religion, even with a theological background, would have been forged through the Catholic of early Protestant categories. Kippenberg, Strunza, and others, Stausberg, and some of us here in the Institute, propose this plaidoyer of understanding how much we inherit all these conceptual frameworks. And the indulgences, and the locality versus nation, it's absolutely splendid. I would like to congratulate you doing this as a pure historian, because the fabric of history is today much more sophisticated than it was even only 50 years ago. If you are doing this as a historian, as a pure historian, without being a historian of religion, is absolutely splendid for historians of religions. Because you integrate profoundly the themes, the topics, the data, and the horizon of religious history within a way in understanding half a millennium of religious history, not only for Germany, and you are combining in a very sophisticated manner, I would say, while congratulating you, this fact that you can read very fine, at times even discrete portions of very early foundational Protestant writings in that, well, this is in German, 16th-century German, not Latin anymore, not universal, not Catholic, etc. And you're proving how we are living after the 19th century, the birth and use up to alt-right and Nazis of nation, and how this Luther influence into the history of thinking, including political thinking, including the evolution of societies and the continent in the Second World War, produced, starting from such discrete entities, while commenting upon the most foundational texts of the canonical Christianity. You would be perhaps surprised to hear that in 19th century Bengal, they coined a term, daika. Perhaps Vlad Chauvel knows better than me. One professor trained in Chicago with the pupils of Eliade and Wendy Doniger, Hugh Urban, who is now a professor at the Ohio State University, absolutely clever and most industrious, wrote a book about 19th century, 19th, 20th century Bengal, history of Hinduism and the Tantra traditions. And in his second chapter, has a discussion about this mortgage fee or indebtedness fee, which in the local community for the neighbor should pay this because this is his personal sin. This is a kind of indulgence which was discovered by the colonial Englishmen who were all Protestants and said, this is very Catholic. This is very Catholic. I shall dispel all this. I mean, you see how far this can function. Even this in classical Hinduism, you have nothing properly connected to this type of thinking. But just to move a bit beyond Benedict Anderson, which I a bit know, I would suggest that the framework of Lakoff, of the cognitive metaphors, is also very important because, as I hope, together with one expert, Religionswissenschaftler from Bern, Professor Jens Schlitter, in an issue on the cognitive fiscal metaphor of karma in Religion, Routledge, 2013, we struggled with this fiscalization of virtue within Indic religions, comparing them with the interpretation of Catholic or Protestant, different varieties, of Indulgences scholars who tried during the last 2 centuries to understand how Vedic Rina transformed itself into debt, the karmic debt, the karmic ledger, the karmic accountancy, the karmic bank account, etc. And this traversed everything, but it started almost from nothing. So if you, the very idea of indulgences from the Catholic perspective, or the very idea of negating the robbery by indulgences by the Catholics through the Protestant, is something which simply traverses all the history of religions, and it is something we must all think of. So I would like very much to congratulate you for offering us this lecture, and I do hope our colleagues now online or in the future on our YouTube channel would benefit as well as from your, because you mentioned already something from the title of your communication for the World Congress in Bucharest, having the Rome in your own city, and this critique, Protestant critique of the omni-persistence, of the omni-locality of Rome. So thank you very much for coming. All the best, all best wishes for the completion of your dissertation, and we would very much love to stay in contact and to read each other. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone online as well. And thank you for having me. This was quite an exciting opportunity, and it's been very kind of you to stay on and listen for this long. Thank you.